Good morning. I'm going to get started right on the nose because I got a lot to cover, so I want to make sure we use as much of our time as we have. This is restoring sanity to JavaScript development with Ember 2. In case you didn't notice, hopefully you're in the right room. When I was titling this talk, I was trying to think of something catchy to get you guys to show up. I appreciate you showing up super early on Friday morning. But really, any of us that work in JavaScript have to admit that our ecosystem's a little insane, that there's a lot of craziness going on. It's hard to keep up with everything that happens. Feels like every year we've got something new that comes up that catches everybody's eye and everybody rushes over there, and then we do that for a little while, and then something else new comes up and we rush somewhere else. And I'm going to actively avoid comparing Ember to anything else for the majority of this talk. I really just want to communicate and share with you a lot of the things that I love about working in Ember, expose you to a whole lot of stuff, hopefully give you some things that you can look into deeper on your own in the future. Found this image on Twitter somewhere. I couldn't find the source for it, so if anybody knows where it came from, let me know. I'd love to credit them. And whenever we do talk about frameworks, this is the only comparison graph I'll show you. Inevitably, somebody will throw up something like this, which is the Google search traffic for various JavaScript frameworks. And you can obviously see Angular taking off, especially around 2013, and continuing to accelerate. You see React, especially taking off in 2015, and then Ember's kind of hanging out down there at the bottom. I like to joke sometimes that Ember users have to look up less documentation, so we Google less. But inevitably this leads some people who are like trying to pick a JavaScript framework or figure out what they want to use to build their application to say like, why would I even look at Ember? And really, I think that the key is that Ember is really well suited for a specific use case that doesn't fit all of our JavaScript needs. And that's a lot of what I want to cover today. So if we ask ourselves, well, what is Ember then? If you go to the Ember.js website, the first thing you're hit with is this headline, that Ember is a framework for creating ambitious web applications. And while catchy, it doesn't really define what that is or how that might help us. So I'll start here with a quick example. This is a demo walkthrough of an app done by a startup down in Cincinnati called Battery. So this is a brainstorming tool for teams. So within companies like Procter & Gamble, if a team is brainstorming ideas, they can import image, import text, do all sorts of things. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of interactivity here that you wouldn't see in a typical web application. So there's dragging and dropping, things are changing immediately, toolbars popping up, all sorts of craziness going on. And I'm not trying to get into the specifics, but you can really see how this experience, even though this is a web application, feels very native. And I really think that these are the kinds of experiences that Ember is extremely well suited for. So to step back, I'll start with, let's compare that to a traditional server-generated application. So like any good programming discussion, I'm going to create a false dichotomy here. There's obviously a lot of middle ground in between these things, but just so that we're all on the same page. With our browser on the left, our servers here on the right, traditional server rendered application would send a request to the server for some sort of page based on a URL and receive back HTML along with CSS, JavaScript, images, whatever else we need to build the page. And at that point, the browser renders the page. Well, then we perform some other sort of action. We click another link, we submit a form, whatever it may be, sends another HTTP request to the server sends back a new set of HTML, and the browser renders the page. And this process repeats over and over. So every time we would perform an action on a fully server-rendered application, we're having to reload and refresh the entire page in the browser. Which obviously makes it very difficult to give the kind of experiences we just saw, like with the Battery brainstorming application. So if we look at a different approach to this, this is how a client-side application, a single-page application like an Ember-built application, would communicate. It still sends an original request for the first URL you're trying to access. You're going to receive back HTML with your JavaScript and your CSS and your images, just like we did with the server application, and the browser will render the page. So here it's the same, but from here forward it changes. Especially with Ember, you are loading the entire application into the client. So you have all the templates you're going to need to render anything you're going to do. You have all of the logic you need to perform operations on the client side. And from then on, you only have to communicate with the server to receive data, which you typically receive back as JSON. And there is no re-render, there is no full page reloads going on. So this, because we're maintaining an application session on the front end and continuing to work with the same piece of code, there's so much more interactivity that this opens up for us. Now, since we've really separated these concerns, and since every subsequent request is just requesting data, we actually can even split these servers. So we can do things like serve up our Ember application from S3 and CloudFront if we want it to be on a content delivery network and load fast around the globe, and then access our API from some other server. In fact, there's a trend called static applications, where you can distribute an application that actually accesses an API that you don't even own, or multiple APIs that you don't even own. You can build an application that runs entirely in the browser, and I've got a side project that runs entirely against GitHub, so I don't run a server side at all. I just deliver HTML and JavaScript, run the application in the browser, and then everything from that point on just communicates with the GitHub API. Now this idea of splitting the concerns of receiving the code for our application and then where our data store is to communicate is actually one that is fairly familiar to us in another area, and that is native app development. When we develop native applications, we download the application, get it from whatever app store we're using, and then from then on, that application may be communicating with a back-end service purely over an API. And really, this is the mindset I try to get people in when we're developing Ember applications, because this is really what Ember excels at, is not trying to do some hybrid of some things are coming from the server and some things are being generated on the client. You're really going to have your biggest success with Ember as a framework if you're really thinking full client-side interactive application, just communicating with your data API. Now, obviously there's a lot going on here, but it does enable some really great experiences. There are a lot of companies that I'm sure, no matter who you are, you recognize a few of these logos up here, and that are using Ember within their companies and various teams. Not every product that all of these companies do is an Ember product, but there are teams within each of these companies that are using Ember with great success. So with any client application, we've got a couple things we're going to have to cover. We're going to have to cover how you write markup and create HTML, and how you define interactions. So we'll start with these two. So let's start with markup. This is an Ember handlebars template. It's just HTML. So at its base, when you're writing an Ember template, you're writing HTML. It's nothing strange. This is something that any HTML fluent designer could come in and modify and add content, things like that. And then within Ember, we do use handlebar syntax to give us some Ember-specific abilities. This is a link helper to create a link to an about route, and we can also use the handlebars to insert data into our templates, and we'll see that as we move forward. Okay, so now interaction. Here's an example right here of we're gonna look at a basic component. A lot of things in Ember follow this pattern. I'm going to show components specifically just to give you an idea of how you define interactions within Ember. So this is a basic component that if we were building an Airbnb style service and we had rentals, this would display the data related to a specific rental. And if we had, say, an index page of some sort, we'd have some surrounding markup, and then we'd be using this each helper to loop through the rentals, assigning each to a rental unit variable, and then we'd be rendering this rental listing component with passing the rental unit to the component as rental. So if we go back to our template for this component, we say we're going to want to add the ability to view an image right within the index list. So we may want to surround this with some sort of conditional, if is image showing, and then we create an image tag, bind the image source and the alt text depending on the specific rental. And then if image is not showing, we're going to create a button to show the image. So then with the component, we've also got a JavaScript file that supports this. So in this case, we, and you'll notice as I show JavaScript examples, this is a good time to mention this, is that throughout the Ember ecosystem, you'll see ES6 syntax used all over the place. The Ember build tools bring in Babel by default, and it's pretty much community convention to use as much ES6 as is helpful for you. Everything in Ember is structured with ES6 modules. And I know it's called ES 2015, but now since it's 2016, I'm going to call it ES6, since everybody knows what that means. So here we are extending the default Ember component, and we are adding an attribute of is image showing false. So this is obviously will fulfill our conditional and give us half of our interactivity, but we need a way to change that value to adjust the state of the component. So we're going to take our button and we are going to attach to it an action called image show. Then we're going to jump right back into our component JavaScript, and we are going to add to this an actions hash. And this is a ES6 function, so image show is a function here. And simply we're going to set it is image showing to true. And this is really the pattern that you'll see all over the place when you're dealing with components, when you're dealing with controllers. Throughout any Ember application, this same pattern repeated over and over will get us that same repeated. So we can see how now when we first load a rental listing, we'll be getting the else part of the conditional and we'll get the show image button. We click it, that action image show changes the value of is image showing and thus reveals our image. So we've covered markup and interaction, so now we can go build an application, right? Well, not really, not if you're building an ambitious client-side application like what Ember is well suited for. Inevitably, no matter what JavaScript framework you're using, there are other things you're going to need to pull this off. You're going to need some sort of build tool. You're going to need some way to organize these files and package them up. You're going to need testing methods. I work for a company called Test Double. Obviously, we love testing, so I have to cover this. You're going to need a router. So we want to be able to manage state, but we also want our users to experience the power of the web. We want our URLs to be shareable and reusable. We're going to need some way to load data from our back end and persist that on the client side and manage the state of that data. We want some way to share code. I don't always want to have to reinvent the wheel. I love leveraging other people's work and not having to do it myself. And then obviously we need some way to deploy this. We need to get it out onto a server so that people can use our application and gain that value from it. So when we look at Ember's build tools, we see Ember CLI, which is simply an NPM package you just install, and then it gives you an Ember command line command to do all sorts of things with your Ember application. This makes it super easy to get an Ember application up and running. To demonstrate just how easy that is, I'm just going to share with you a little screencast here. This is all in real time. The only place that I had adjusted this is I did cut out 50 seconds of the NPM install. For any of you that have used NPM, that shouldn't surprise you that we would have. I didn't feel like we should sit here and watch NPM install for a full minute. So we cd into the directory that we just created with Ember new, run Ember serve, and Ember is going to start up a live reload server as well as a development server. And then it builds our application. The initial build takes a little bit. Subsequent builds are a lot faster. And then we see welcome to Ember. So we have an Ember application. If we open up the page source, you can actually see there's no HTML inside those body tags. All we've got is CSS files and JavaScript files. Ember does package up the vendor JavaScript, all of your application's dependencies separately from your application-specific JavaScript, which is really nice, especially when those get fingerprinted in production. Your users won't have to download the entire big Ember payload every time you update one thing about the specifics of your application. That larger payload changes a lot less often, so we let the user's browser cache it separately. So, I mentioned there's a live reload server, so we'll switch back over here to the terminal. I'm going to open up an editor, and we'll look here in, we see all the directory structure that Ember gives us right out of the box. App templates, the application is our application layout, and I'm going to change this to welcome to test double, switch right back to the browser, and it's already changed. We didn't even have to refresh the page. So this makes for really nice, quick development. This is the kind of thing I love when it's in place, but I'm too lazy to set up on my own. So in other apps, I wouldn't go to the trouble of setting up live reload, and then I'd pay for it the entire development cycle. With Ember, you get it right out of the box, works automatically. So let's cover a little bit of testing. If I go back to this application, and I don't want to welcome you to test double as much as I love test double, but we're at CodeMash, so I really want this to say CodeMash. Now, if we go to our local host 4200 tests, we actually have test them right here already running. The tests that are there are just JS hint, checking our generated files. So I'm going to generate an acceptance test for the index here. And then we're going to switch back to the editor, and we'll look in tests, acceptance, index test. You can see the ES6 syntax throughout here as well. I'm going to edit this test. It uses QUnit by default, but there's really great community support for Mocha as well, and some people working on some of the other client testing frameworks if you have preferences. But I'm going to visit the root here, find the H2, check that the text is welcome to CodeMash. Now when I switch back to the browser, just like with our running application code, we'll see that our tests were automatically rerun. We've got a failing test. So I switch back to the editor. We'll update this heading to welcome us to CodeMash. And when we switch back to the browser, we've got a passing test. And we can verify it in our development application as well. So, I mean, again, testing is one of those things where you could spend days and days configuring it to be exactly like you like. This is literally, there's nothing missing from this. Everything you've just seen chained together is how long it takes you to have this up and running with Ember, which is pretty astounding. So one of the biggest strengths of Ember is the router. If you've ever used a interactive client application and tried to command click a link to open in a new tab or something, or copied a link and sent it to a friend, and then they open it on their device and they see something completely different, you know that the frustration we sometimes have with client-side routing. I'm going to digress a little bit into what I think is really good URL structure. Give credit to this to Tom Dale, who was here 2 years ago and gave an entire talk just on having really great URLs in your application. Say we're trying to use this Airbnb style app, and we've got a URL like /rentals, and this is communicating that we're trying to access some sort of view of a list of rentals. Well, we might have a URL also like /rentals/3, where 3 is the ID of a particular model, a particular rental model. That we've got, might have /rentals and we want to view them in some particular order. So we might send a query parameter for sort and tell it to sort it by rating. And that's something we'd expect a controller to take care of. And then we might even have nested URLs. So you might have, within the context of that rental, you want to view a particular comment. Now, this is just good URL structure. If no matter whether you're building a server-rendered application or client-side application, this is what good URLs look like. They communicate intent. They communicate what information you're dealing with, and they're very clear and understandable. And in Ember, this is exactly what URLs look like. But this is super important to the Ember core team and has been a key part of Ember from day one. Now there's one thing you'll notice is not in any of these URLs, and that's a hash. I consider myself a little bit of a URL snob. I can't stand it when I see a hash in a URL, especially not if it's accompanied with a bang. It just drives me nuts. So please do not do this. So Ember uses push state and the history API to communicate state back to the browser so that the browser's URL is always up to date. It also lets things like the back button work like users on the web expect the back button to work. So I'm going to quickly add a route just to show how this works in this application. As you can see, I've added a little bit of index content. I've done that by simply leveraging the fact that we have an outlet in our application template, and I've added a template for an index. The index route is defined by default. You can see in our router that there's actually nothing defined in the router map here, giving us that index, but it happens by default. So I'm going to Ember generate route. I'm going to create an about route so we can explain to our users what's so great about our application. You can see that already generated, inserted the route in the router.js and created an about template for us. I'm going to add some markup in here for content specific to this route. It's about content. If I switch back to the browser, I can visit /about, and I get my about content. But we don't expect users to navigate a web application by typing URLs. So I'll jump back into the application template and add a couple links to switch between these two routes. So here we're using the link to helper that we saw earlier, telling it to link to the index route, and we'll give that the text of home. These are really me typing, so I still made mistakes, but at least I'm not sitting here in front of you and not sure if things are going to work. And then we'll add a link to the about route as well. Now we switch back to the browser. Our live reload is taken over. We've got our links. You can see as we click back and forth, the URL updates up there in the browser bar. And then, as I mentioned, you can use the back buttons and the forward buttons. They work just like they should on the web. We didn't break any default browser functionality, and I right-clicked on the About link and also opened it in a new tab, and you can see it loaded straight to it. So we can get all of this great interactivity in these ambitious applications without breaking the way users expect the web to work, and really what I think makes the web extraordinary. So let's talk about data. How do we get data from our server and persist that data? Ember has a built-in way of doing this with Ember data. I'm not going to go too in-depth with Ember data. There's a whole lot we could talk about. If you're more interested, you should go to Brian Gansler's talk yesterday at 3:30 in the afternoon. But he went much more in-depth with this. But at the most basic case, Ember data lets us, we also have a route file in addition to a page level controller. And we can grab our model in here, create a model function, and then in this case, we are reaching into our data store, which is controlled by Ember data, and we're asking Ember data to find all of our rentals. Ember data, if it has anything in memory, will return that, and then depending on your configuration, by default, it will return whatever it has, and then also perform a network request to make sure that what it has is current, and then update that when it gets it. This returns a promise. Ember uses promises all over the place. If you're familiar with JavaScript promises, if you're not, Ember is a great way to force yourself to learn them because they're everywhere. But this is really cool because you're only interacting with your local data store, And then Ember data on its own, if we've just loaded this application brand new and we have no data, it will on its own do a get for the /rentals route on your API server. You can configure Ember data, tell it where that is. And there's a whole lot of customization and configuration you can do with this. Out of the box, Ember data supports JSON API standard. If your API is built to the JSON API standard, you shouldn't have to do much adapting at all. If your API is anything other than that, which for any existing API is probably true, you can write adapters for Ember data so that Ember data knows how to communicate to your API, knows where to access various resources, and then you can still, within your application code, you won't have to change how you're interacting with Ember data. You just change how Ember data interacts with your API server. So next we need code sharing. We come up with great ideas, we find great ways of doing things, we want to share them with other people, open source them, let those people contribute back to us and make our stuff better for free. And we do this through what we call Ember add-ons. This is similar to other package sharing systems like Ruby Gems or NPM. In fact, under the hood, Ember add-ons are NPM modules. They're just specific to Ember. If you're looking for Ember add-ons or you want to get an idea of what Ember add-ons can do, I would recommend going to emberaddons.com. This is a great resource to browse and search for add-ons that may be of use to you. You'll see that some of these have scores over here in this column. Those scores come from a complimentary website called emberobserver.com, where the curators at Ember Observer actually go into each Ember add-on and look at the source and give it. The scores are kind of interesting. They have a scoring system you can look at, so they check things like, does it have more than one contributor? Does it have recent activity? Does it have meaningful tests? Things like that. You can get points for all of that, and that's where those scores come from. So I wouldn't take the scores just at face value, but they're at least of value to give you some indication of how trustworthy this is. So if we want to use an add-on, we can go to one of these sites and we can search for, say, our favorite add-on author and see what we might want to use. I'm going to jump into one of my simpler ones, Ember CLI Octacons down there at the bottom. If you're not familiar with GitHub's Octacons, it's an icon set that they use for all of their all the icons you see on GitHub are part of the Octacon set, and they've open sourced these. Well, as I mentioned, I have a side project where I'm interacting with GitHub, so it's really beneficial to me to get the GitHub icons for free and be able to use those for consistency for users' sake. When I first went to install them, Octacons are only distributed via Bower, and within Ember, in order to use them, you have to add it to your Bower file, in Bower install. Then you've got to do some configuration to tell Ember CLI to include the correct font files in the place where you're going to have them as part of your build, and then you've got to add the CSS for all the icon classes to your CSS file. And I did all this configuration, and I realized, like, why should anybody else have to do that configuration? So I packaged all of that configuration up into an add-on, and then by doing that, it makes, for anybody else, if any of you create something where Octacons would be helpful, all you have to do is Ember install Ember CLI Octacons, and that'll work like that. So Ember install is really just an extension of npm install. It performs an npm install of the package, and then it runs a set of any blueprints that might be defined with the add-on. So in the case of my Octacons add-on, things like adding the configurations to make sure that the assets get imported correctly where they need to be is something that's specific to using Ember install. So then obviously we've built this incredible, highly interactive, ambitious web application, and we need to deploy it out to somewhere where our users can use it. So this is a great example of where Ember has had entire sub-communities crop up to fill some of these needs. Ember CLI deploy has become the de facto standard for extended deployment process. Now, with Ember, you can any Ember CLI application, even the one that I just showed you that I created, you can run an Ember build at any time, and it will build a production-ready, fingerprinted, concatenated, minified package and put it in a dist folder. In that dist folder, you could upload to a server somewhere, but often we're in situations where we have a lot more complicated deploy process. Maybe there's some aspect where you've got a Rails server running somewhere that needs to be able to grab your index HTML and serve it up in the context of some other part of your web property or something. And Ember CLI deploy gives us really simple, or I won't say simple, nothing's simple in programming. Gives us really configurable and understandable ways to configure our deployment to match specifically our need while still maintaining the ability to run a command as simple as Ember deploy and then our environment to get that application up. Again, I'm not going to go super in-depth here, but the way Ember CLI deploy does this is by setting up a whole bunch of hooks that then, depending on your deployment strategy, you can attach different things to different hooks so that the processes you need for your deployment strategy happen in the correct order and get you where you need to go. I'm going to use a simple example of if I'm just wanting to upload everything to S3, but it's being served through CloudFront as well, how this might work. All the plugins will use the configure step to pull in configuration. This will give us things like our AWS keys. Ember CLI deploy build, the build plugin runs in the build hook, as you'd expect, and builds our application. So as I said, you can run Ember build, and this does that for you. Then maybe we want to run a gzip plugin to gzip all of our assets to make them nice and small and quick downloads before we upload. And then also we may want to assemble a manifest of what those files are and compare them to what's already on S3 so that instead of sitting there and waiting for all of our files to upload again, we only upload the files that change. And then that manifest can get consumed by a plugin like the S3 plugin, which, as you can guess, uploads our files to S3. And then this is another one of my add-ons. The CloudFront plugin can run to, say, invalidate the cache for our index.html. Since index.html is not fingerprinted and won't cache bust on its own, I add my own hook here at the end to invalidate that one file on CloudFront automatically. So when I run an Ember deploy production on an application that's using this deployment strategy, all of this happens automatically. I've picked these plugins out to perform this particular set of tasks because they meet that particular need. And then, as with any Ember add-on, installing these is as simple as Ember install Ember CLI deploy, which gives us kind of the core package that creates those hooks. And then I've actually published this particular deployment strategy as a package, so you don't even have to know about all those plugins or what they do. You can just install the AWS pack for Ember CLI deploy and then add your configuration keys, and all of that will happen for you with Ember deploy. So we've covered all of these things. I couldn't stop here because there's so much really cool stuff happening in the Ember ecosystem that I also want to tell you about because it gets me excited to work with this every day. So we have bonus content. First of all, in development, we always want to know what our application is doing. Inevitably, no matter how familiar we are with any particular framework or set of tools, we're going to have issues. We're going to run into problems. That's where the Ember inspector comes into play. Here I've loaded up a simple application, Ember application that has a list of our friends, and some of them have things that we have loaned out to them. And we're going to show you how the Ember inspector works here to let us see what's going on with this application while it's running in the browser. So I open up my developer tools, and you can see I've got an Ember tab. And here we've got the view tree. You can actually see which templates are being rendered where on the page. We can actually view the entire set of the application's routes, so all routes that are defined, or we can limit it down to just the ones that are in use for the current route. We can inspect the Ember data live, so you can see here that the 8 friends have been loaded in, but we don't currently have any articles. So if I click one of the links To view one of the friends that does have articles, Ember data has gone out and fetched that user's articles, and now you can see we've got 3 articles in the data store. As we upgrade Ember versions over time, things get deprecated before they get removed, so the deprecations tab gives us a chance to review that. The info tab can let us view what versions of Ember we're dealing with. And then there's some more advanced stuff. There's actually a promises inspector. All of the promises that have run in our application we can inspect here, see where things might be failing. We can view the container and see all of the templates, controllers, routes that are being loaded. And you can even debug render performance. I will note these numbers are not absolutely accurate, but they are pretty good for relative comparison. So if you've got a rendering bottleneck somewhere, they're pretty good for figuring out which portion of your application, what part of your template might be causing a rendering issue. But this is really great to be able to look inside the internals of your application. There's some neat things I didn't even cover. You can grab like particular instances, like I want to grab the instance of this particular controller and you interact with it in my console, and it can assign particular pieces of your application to the $E variable, and then you just go right in your console and do $E, and then you can pretend like you're inside that thing, interacting with it, setting or changing properties, and seeing how that affects your application. Another really cool tool is Ember CLI Mirage. Mirage is a mock data server that completely fakes out your backend. So if you are developing an application where the API is being developed in parallel and maybe doesn't exist yet, Mirage gives you a way to define what you'd expect to get back from that API, and also then lets us use that for testing as well, so that our tests don't have to run against the live API and our tests can be a lot faster. Again, this is an Ember add-on, install Ember CLI Mirage. Defining our endpoints is really rather straightforward. If say we're trying to access an API route at /API/users, we can go into our Mirage config and tell it to just return to us an array of users. So this is basically like fixture data. Like I said, this works in our development environment and our test environment. However, in most cases, if you've got any sort of functionality where you're editing users or changing this data in any way, you're going to want to be a little bit more interactive than just receiving the same array every time you request it. So Mirage also actually has its own kind of faked out database. Well, it is a real database, but runs its own database that you can interact with. So if we want to do that, we can return db.users instead. And then we can set up what a user might look like. And this can let us experiment with all sorts of fake data. You can see here we've actually imported Faker as part of Ember CLI Mirage. So say we want the name to be equal to person, and with the just the iterated ID there. We'll give it a default age. We'll not have it be an admin. And then we'll use Faker here to give us an avatar as well. And then this will all work in development. So then we can set up a scenario. So for, say in development, we want to have 10 non-admin and 1 admin users right out of the box. We can tell our server to create a list of 10 users and create 1 user with admin set to true. So, and then now in our development environment, we've got this data that we can interact with. And because we're using the Mirage database, we can interact with this. So you can have routes that create a new user, update a user, delete a user, and then your application will reflect that during the course of that session. So then we can also use these within tests. So if I write an acceptance test similar to the one we saw earlier, I can set up users right at the beginning, decide that for this particular test I want 3 users, and then when I visit the user's page, I can look to make sure that it's showing me 3 items and checking to make sure that the name's being displayed properly. Now, obviously this can cause a little bit of an issue so let's say our now our API, our backend developer has implemented the user's endpoint, and we no longer want to rely on Mirage for this in development. We want to test our application against the live API or staging environment or whatever it may be. We can tell Mirage to pass through this particular route, which simply tells Mirage not to intercept it, not to stop this request from going out into the world and looking for it at a live URL, and then lets Ember data act in our development environment as it would usually. But now our tests are going to break because we don't have the test set up. So we can export another function alongside the default one in our config, just specifically for test, and just paste in the old configuration that we were using. So this gives you a really nice development path towards eventually just developing against your live API. So you can fake out any of the endpoints you need when you've got them ready and you're wanting to run that against a live API. You just move that code down into your test config so that your tests can continue to use it, and then depend on the live endpoints in development. Another really cool Ember community add-on that is really unique, I think, I've not seen a lot of this happen elsewhere, is Liquid Fire. So Liquid Fire lets us add all sorts of animations and transitions to our applications in a really low friction way. So if you've ever attempted, this is from Edward Faulkner's talk at last year's EmberConf. You can see here as he's transitioning between these pages, the content for the new page is kind of swooping in from the right. The user avatar is kind of coming up from the bottom. And this is all done without having to do any sort of weird CSS trickery or like change your markup to have very specific tied together or weird layouts, or we didn't preload this content to the side. These are just two Ember routes, and Liquid Fire just takes over, renders them, animates, and then gets rid of the old one. And then it can even do what he calls explode transitions, where we can help our users maintain context within our application by grabbing a piece of one view and kind of transitioning that one piece into the new view. I just think this is really cool. I wish I could show some of the Liquid Fire code and how easy this is to implement in an application, but it's really exciting. And this is the kind of stuff that with a server rendered application you're never going to be able to do. And when you go fully client side and you try to be more ambitious, there's some really neat things that you can build in. So now we've got all these tools, all of these opinions have been hoisted upon us, this way of doing things, which we as a community love. I know we as consultants love going into an Ember project because there's so much convention that we know right where to look and right where to get started. We're not confused looking around trying to figure out how this particular project is structured. But now that we've locked ourselves into all this stuff, like, doesn't that mean we're kind of like stuck with it? Like, we're not going to be able to go anywhere? Well, that's really not the case. Ember wants us to have that stability. But without, the phrase that's used in our community is stability without stagnation. That we want to be able to develop a long-running Ember application, have the APIs be stable enough that we can be confident in using them and moving forward, but without sitting still and always relying on the same approaches we've always used. So things move. They move pretty consistently, but it's gradually. It's at a pace where you can keep up with it, where you can stay up to date. And so now, 45 minutes into my hour-long talk, we'll actually talk about Ember 2.0. So I was mentioning the stability inherent in the Ember ecosystem, so I'm going to list for you all of the new features that were released in Ember 2.0. And there are none. Ember 2.0 as a release was purely a cruft removal release. Applications that were running in the Ember 1X series, as they upgraded through the point releases and got up to 1.13. Once you were running 1.13 and you had all your deprecations showing up in the Ember inspector as we saw, Once you had resolved all of those deprecations and you were no longer using any of the deprecated APIs, you were able to upgrade to 2.0, get rid of a huge chunk of legacy code that you were no longer using because it was deprecated and you moved away from it, and now you were running a much slimmer build of Ember. And this is not the way we see it happen in most ecosystems. I know I've done a lot of Rails development, and every time there's a Rails major release, people freak out about the stuff they've got to change in their application and stuff. So this is a great example of the kind of stability that the Ember ecosystem has. But at the same time, we said without stagnation. We don't want to sit still. We don't always want to depend on the same things. Yehuda Katz, one of the core team members for Ember, has been quoted to say, eventually all of the good ideas will end up in Ember. The Ember core team is very cognizant of what's going on in other ecosystems, is always keeping an eye on that, and wanting to make sure that Ember identifies some of the best pieces of what's going on elsewhere and brings that in for our benefit. One of my favorite examples of this is about a year ago at React JS Conf, Ryan Florence gave an example of an application that was render performance. Ember's on the left, Angular's in the middle, and React is on the right. And as you can guess, the Ember community was pretty embarrassed by this. This is not what we'd like to see Ember doing in comparison to other JavaScript frameworks. But it's clear that when you a year ago, when you saddled Ember with a large amount of re-rendering at one time, it just did not stack up to some of its competitors. So about a month later at EmberConf in Portland, Tom and Yehuda showed that they saw the same results. This is the old version of Ember running. This is React and how quickly React was able to do it. And then this is the new version of Ember. This is a great example where they looked at, well, what is giving React that big re-render advantage? And it had a lot to do with the virtual DOM approach that React was employing. So the Ember core team, and especially Yehuda, really dissected what is creating that performance advantage, how can we do that in Ember, and reworked the Ember rendering engine into what became known as Glimmer, which was then made available as part of a point release to all Ember users and required no changes to any of our templates or application code. So every Ember developer got this performance boost without having to change anything in our applications. And this is the kind of stuff that I love about the Ember ecosystem that you can build and be committed to long term, because the community is aware of these things and wants to fix them and will address them, and then we all can benefit from it. So some of the exciting things that are coming up within the Ember ecosystem that I'll just mention briefly. Ember is moving in a direction towards one-way binding. In the early examples of Ember, the two-way binding was really exciting and creates for some really neat experiences with low overhead. But when you get into creating a more complex application, when you have two-way binding everywhere, once one thing changes something and it's all two-way bound, sometimes it's really hard to figure out where that change came from or why that thing changed. One-way binding should make that much more easy to control and intentionally determine which parts of our application should actually be able to change data and state where. We're also moving towards routable components. Currently we use a page-level controller that basically looks just like the component that I just showed you. The only difference is that it has the ability to handle query parameters that may have been passed in with the URL. So we're moving towards controllers not even existing and just being a component. Another exciting thing is fast boot. With any heavy client-side application, the biggest performance hit you've got is right up front. You've got to download. You download that HTML, as I showed you, there's nothing in the body tags, there's nothing rendered on the page, and then you've got to boot up your JavaScript application, run it, and let it render to the page. Now with our example, that was super fast because there wasn't a whole lot going on. But if you've got a really complex application, maybe it's loading a whole bunch of data before it's able to show you the template and stuff, that can be a big performance hit, and that's where we start seeing loading screens on the web, which is not very web-like. Fast boot is it basically allows you to run your Ember application in a node server on the server side, so that your Ember application, the same code that would be running on the client, can render out its initial view, deliver that HTML to the browser so you get the view that you requested right away, and then when the Ember application boots up in the client, it'll take over all of the interaction from there, and from there forward, you'll be using your Ember application. So this has a huge benefit for initial page load times. Also, the Ember community is just outstanding. In terms of programmer communities, the positivity and the inclusiveness and welcoming of the Ember community is unparalleled as far as I'm concerned. I just was interacting with somebody on a pull request over the holidays, and was thinking about how it was so positive that like it made me feel better about the rest of my day. And there's not a whole lot of interactions we have in the programming community where maybe we can say that, but it really is true, and people hold each other to it. I'd encourage you to find a local community. Here in the region, there are several Ember meetups. I help organize the one in Columbus. If you're in the Central Ohio area, check out embercolumbus.com or Ember Columbus on Twitter, and we'd love to have you. We meet the first Monday of the month. But there are several in the area, wherever you may have driven in from for this conference. If you happen to fly in, they're all over the country as well. You can go to emberjs.com. There's a community section where you can actually look up all the meetups. If you happen to be in like one of the huge gaps in between these red pins, or if you're in some far-flung country where you don't have a local community, there's even an Ember Global meetup that happens online, and they do hangouts and bring in speakers to talk about things. And that's really cool. I'd encourage you to check out emberjs.com. There's some really great guides there. They do have a basic tutorial up there, but obviously that's the authoritative source for an awful lot of things regarding Ember. The GitHub organization is a great place to look as well. There's all of the future plans for Ember are done in the open, so there's RFC repos where you can see discussion about potential directions for Ember development in the future. There's a wide open community Slack at embercommunityslackin.herokuapp.com. You can request an invitation to that Slack channel. It's well over 2,500. It's got to be over 3,000 now. But it's a great resource for asking questions, getting help with things you're struggling with. There's a whole bunch of channels related specifically to things like Ember Data and Liquid Fire and some of those cool things I talked about. And also just general question and discussion channels. If you're looking to get started with Ember and you want to know like what is the current like best practice way to really build an Ember application, one of my favorite resources for getting started is this ebook called Ember CLI 101. It's published on LeanPub. It's a pay what you want model, and it starts at free. So if you want it for free, you can download it for free, or you can donate back to the author. But it does a really tremendous job of having you build an Ember application the way that an experienced Ember developer is going to approach it. It uses the CLI, it leverages the testing tools, and really helps you understand what's going on under the hood as you're getting started with Ember. So I work for a company called TestDouble. Justin just left, so I guess I could get away with not mentioning it. Oh, Todd's here, so I guess I have to give the plug. But we are a remote consultancy scattered all over North America, and we love to help teams with build great software and improve their software. If your team needs some help, whether it's you're trying to get up and running with Ember, I personally love helping teams get up and running with Ember, and would love to help your team. But we do a lot of other things. We do a lot of Ruby and Rails and Clojure and JavaScript and testing and all sorts of crazy stuff. So if you need help with anything, shoot us an email at hello@testdouble.com. If you are somebody who likes to help other people, then we also are hiring. shoot us an email, join@testdouble.com, if you like to help other people and build cool software. And my name's Kevin Pefferly. I can be found on Twitter and GitHub at kpefferly. And thanks for coming. Really appreciate you getting up early and spending the hour with me.